Hello and welcome to the American Experiment podcast. I am Bill Walsh, Center of the American Experiment, Director of Marketing and Communication. Joining me today, I've got two Hinderakers in studio for this podcast. I've got Kathryn Hinderaker and John Hinderaker, and then by remote from an undisclosed location in the United States of America somewhere, we have Bill Glahn, our writer extraordinaire. So the four of us are going to talk about some issues of the day. We don't normally talk about national issues or world issues in our little Minnesota think tank, but hard to ignore what's going on in the world. But we thought we'd try to make a connection to what's happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip to Minnesota. So first topic, first way that's connected to Minnesota is we wrote this post this week about the Minnesota social studies standards. And it's kind of striking. The language, to go back a step, the Twin Cities Democrat Socialists of America chapter put out a statement right away about what happened. And, of course, it's a pro-Hamas, anti-Israel statement.
Pro-baby killing.
Pro-baby killing, yeah, pro-horrors. It's a long statement defending what happened, and the terminology struck me. They kept using this word settler colonialism, settler colonists and decolonization and dispossession, and that they over and over and over you see those words. So the premise is the Israelis are colonialists and they're settlers and the Palestinians are the victims of this. And I started thinking about, where have I seen this language before? Well, this language I've seen before is in Minnesota's draft social studies standards, full of the same language. And they even the DSA, the Twin Cities DSA, made a connection to settler colonialists from Israel and Palestine to settler colonialists, European Americans to Native Americans or indigenous peoples. They made that connection in their statement. So just take 2 minutes to look up our standards and see multiple references to settler colonialism, decolonization, dispossession.
It's very weird applied to Israel because, the settler colonialist was Moses. That was 3,500 years ago. The Arabs didn't arrive until more than 2 millennia later. So I'm not quite sure what the theory is where the Arabs are supposedly the indigenous people and the Jews the settler colonialists.
Depends where you start paying attention, what time in history you start counting from.
Yeah, and who could make a better claim to being on the land that's their land than Israelis?
I mean, I remember a couple of years ago there was this big thing in the United Nations where these people were saying that the Jews had no historic connection to Jerusalem. And it's like, wait a minute, what? Have these people not read the Bible? I mean, it's complete madness.
Questionable source, the Bible. It's not been printed very many times throughout history. And we could go into that. It's just we had the State House Republicans put a statement. I sent a letter to Governor Walsh pointing this out. I like to think they read our post on AmericanExperiment.org and then said, hey, we should connect with Governor Walsh on this. So they wrote him a letter saying, hey, aren't you concerned about the standards and this use of these terminologies in the same language? And it got in the press a little bit. And the press, of course, in Minnesota, predictably said, well, settler colonialism as it relates to Native Americans is different than, over in Israel and the Middle East. And okay, geographically it's different, but it's the same language. The point I was trying to make is that it's the same language. It's the same sentiment. And if you read the social studies standards draft, the benchmarks, if you really read the whole document, when you're done and you think about this is what our kids are going to be taught throughout K through 12 in history.
The effort is to delegitimize the United States of America.
Yep.
And they're using the very same techniques to delegitimize Israel and to delegitimize the United States of America. That is the point.
Right. When you're done reading it, you think, what's your opinion of America? What are our kids going to think of our country when they're done reading these standards? Very negative view of our country. And that's kind of the broader point of what we tried to do. We'll see if it gets anywhere. I mean, by the way, the social studies standards draft is in front of an administrative law judge right now. If you want to go to raiseourstandardsmn.com, you can weigh in. You can participate until October 26th. So if you've seen this before October 26th, go ahead and weigh in and take action. The other piece they did, they had one of the Hamas apologists on connecting George Floyd. I mean, they're just so good at this. So some guy's over in the Middle East, and he understands the left-wing politics of the country, and he connects this to George Floyd as a victim of racism. George Floyd, Palestinians, the same?
Well, there's a certain analogy. I mean, those 1,400 Jews who were murdered by Gazans and the women who were raped by Gazans, the babies who were burned alive or decapitated by Gazans are victims of racism. So I think there is a certain analogy there.
Wow. Yeah, powerful stuff. And connections. The other thing that happened just yesterday, depending on when you're listening to this, but there was a rally at our state capitol. And again, you just have to think, what is going on in our country? What is going on in our state? And we have a little video we can play of the rally at the Capitol. This is Minnesota State Capitol. I guess we're no different than anywhere else in the country or in the world right now. We can cue up just a couple of videos of what's going on.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Free, free Palestine! 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 Get louder, guys! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Does it work? Oh, yeah.
So it's a big crowd. It's not a small crowd. It's estimated 1,000 people. I think it might even be more than 1,000 people.
And the other thing you could hear them chanting is the classic "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free."
Free of Jews.
Yeah, free of Jews. I mean, that's originally from Hamas. That is a saying that clearly, when used by Hamas, means getting rid of the Jews in the Middle East. And I think that's something that's not talked about enough, honestly, is how deep that anti-Semitism is within that entire community. Hamas, terrible. Not everyone, obviously, in Gaza and these areas have anything to do with Hamas, but there's really deep-rooted anti-Semitism that a lot of people don't want to talk about, but that's clearly there and true, and we're seeing it here in America as a result in Minnesota at our capital.
Well, Jew hatred is their entire ideology. It's their whole reason for being. And Hamas is the duly elected government in Gaza,
Yeah.
And the idea that they don't speak for the Gazan people, well, if they don't, I don't know who does. I think the number of people who are either involved with, supportive of, or collaborating with Hamas in Gaza, large majority. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to launch the kind of attack that they did the other day.
Yeah, and let's make another Minnesota connection. Bill Glahn, you followed the life and times and political career of Ilhan Omar, our congresswoman. Aren't we proud? So she of course so predictable in her behavior and her tweets, and I'm not even sure she had a tweet right away with the bombing of the parking lot of the hospital, and I don't think she's taken that down despite the community notes and everything else telling her she's wrong. Have you seen that recently, Bill, at her Twitter account and her activity?
Yeah, she keeps doubling down. She keeps violating the first rule of holes, which is stop digging. So she was all in on this, what turned out to be a false account of what happened to the hospital in Gaza. She was tweeting that it was an Israeli atrocity, and it was found out to be a mistake by Hamas itself, accidentally bombing its own hospital. She won't back off. She says, well, maybe that's true, but there needs to be investigation of it. And this isn't the first time in the last week where she's been caught promoting Hamas propaganda that has later been debunked, where she's had to say or admit, well, maybe it's on both sides. But it's just, she's picked a side in this. She's on the side of Hamas. She says she's on the side of the Palestinians. But as John just pointed out, Hamas is the duly elected representatives of that territory.
And by the way, Bill, we also should add, this is not the first time that Hamas or Islamic Jihad, one of these terrorist groups, they are not very good at firing rockets. This has happened in prior exchanges where they have a rocket that misfires or that falls short and it lands somewhere in Gaza, and they immediately claim that it was an Israeli bombing, and then it turns out to be false. This is something we have seen more than once before. And the fact that the American press and the European press fell for it, they just fell all over themselves, repeating the Hamas propaganda here. We've seen this story before.
The media, I mean, one good thing about this kind of, how we've seen this reported here in America just so poorly. This is just such an obvious example of how the media does no work. These people are the laziest people I have ever witnessed. They take a literal press release from Hamas and say, Headline news. The AP said,
AP.
headline news, this is what happened. No, it's not. In fact, very quickly, Israel and the IDF and Al Jazeera, they all came out with videos of this happening and showing that that's not at all. What Hamas reported is, of course, completely wrong, and there weren't nearly that many deaths. Thank God. There weren't anywhere near 500 deaths.
And that's also not new, and not national. That happens locally on.
Yeah.
That's a big thing. But it happens on all the small things, too.
That's what, if you listen to Ruthless podcast ever, that's one of their famous lines is the easiest job in the world is being a DFL press secretary, because all you have to do is email your press releases to the press and they print them verbatim. I mean, it's what they do. If they find something that confirms what they want to be true, apparently it's not tested at all. It's no holes are poked. It's just printed.
The old adage of too good to check applies to the majority of the contents of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. But guys, I want to go back to that rally at the Minnesota Capitol. I mean, it's kind of jarring for those of us who have lived in the state for a long time to hear 1,000 people chanting Allahu Akbar on the steps of the Minnesota Capitol. I mean, what's going on here?
Right, and certainly have a right to do it. Certainly wouldn't want to shut it down. That's your right to protest. But I want to learn. I want to go and talk to folks and say, why are you here? What is your background? What are you doing in Minnesota? Welcome. But what are we? Is there risk of the republic? From within, right? I mean, and that's a small number you could say, but I agree. I was kind of disturbed too by the rhetoric and right at our Capitol. So.
And, these people, there have been worldwide demonstrations on behalf of Hamas, and it's really, my expectations of the left are very, very low. I'm hard to disappoint when it comes to left-wing behavior, but I admit that I have been shocked. These people are absolutely unembarrassed by the decapitation of infants, by mass murder, by videos of Gazans going around with AK-47s looking for Jews to murder, gang rapes, entire families killed, I don't know how many, kidnapped, and taken into Gaza. These are some of the worst atrocities that have been seen in modern times. And these pro-Hamas demonstrators around the world are absolutely unembarrassed.
Well, Hamas is wearing GoPros in some cases.
Yeah.
They're filming these whole things. That video was taken at the Minnesota Capitol, was taken off of Snapchat, posted publicly. They're not afraid. So I hope people see with your eyes. Look, hear what they're saying. See with your eyes. They mean what they say.
Right. Very good. All right, we got to move on. More locally, Feeding Our Future has been a topic that we've written a lot about. Bill Glahn has written a lot about. There is news in Feeding Our Future, right, Bill? Keith Ellison shutting down a bunch of nonprofits. Good. Attorney General's his job is to monitor nonprofits in Minnesota. But I mean, you can give us the background, but I'm just struck by there's a lot of work left to do in the Feeding Our Future fraud, right?
Right. Oh, there's a huge amount. We're still fairly early on in the whole proceedings, even though there have been 60 individuals indicted. There have been 14 guilty pleas in the case. And what Attorney General Ellison is doing is moving to shut down some of the nonprofits associated with this. And he's filed lawsuits against 23 nonprofits. He had earlier moved to shut another one down, so that brings it up to 24. There could easily be another 200 or 300 nonprofits that we could profitably follow the same path on. And all of these ones that he's gone after so far, they're already shut down. They aren't in operation. And in fact, most of them, about 2/3 of them, are associated with people who have already pled guilty in the federal criminal case. But what he's trying to do is make sure these corporate entities, which are still in operation, at least on paper, don't rise from the dead and get used in furtherance of some other fraudulent scheme. But what I found interesting about what the Attorney General did yesterday, again, most of these have to do with people who are either indicted or have already been convicted in criminal cases. But there are a handful that aren't really linked directly to anybody who's been indicted so far. And 2 of them have links to some fairly prominent DFL folks. So there's one that he's shutting down, having the corporation dissolved, which a bunch of these fraudsters use to further a scheme in the Feeding Our Future scandal, millions of dollars taking out, was originally founded by Jamal Osman, who is the sitting Ward 6 council member of the Minneapolis City Council. He was the one who founded the company, but he and his wife handed over ownership of this company to a bunch of other people who went on afterward to use it for this fraudulent purpose. They've never been accused of any wrongdoing, but then Osman's wife, whose name is Ilo Amba, founded another nonprofit, which the Attorney General seems to be accusing her of using for fraudulent purposes in this Feeding Our Future scam. She apparently got $460,000 out of her short-lived nonprofit from the feeding program. The Attorney General is using his powers to have the corporation dissolved. And it's interesting, you were talking about the easiest thing to be a DFL press secretary. The Star Tribune went and asked questions of Jamal Osman, and he says, well, I'm too busy to talk now. I don't have anything to say. So, Bill Walsh, you were a Republican press secretary. Could a Republican office holder running for re-election next month get away with no comment in a major scandal?
I'm glad you bring it up. I think there should be huge scrutiny on this guy and his wife. And when we were investigating all of this, I don't know, a year ago, maybe more, I went to that office of one of the nonprofit that she ran. It's in a building in Minneapolis, just off downtown. There's no way there were meals served at that office in that parking lot with the security at the door. And there were purported to be thousands and thousands of meals served to kids out of that office. I mean, it's not hard to report this. There's just obviously a lack of curiosity or a lack of willingness to put this on the front page.
You know, our press is 100% corrupt. They report what they want to report, and they cover up what they don't want to report.
Well, the other thing, Jamal Osman, there's tons to write about, Bill. What about his political contributions? And we've traced that, or you've written about that on our page at least.
Right. Well, he's been very involved with the Feeding Our Future. Again, he's not been indicted. His wife has not been indicted, but he's been linked to these two nonprofits. His wife, if you read the lawsuit that Keith Ellison filed, it seems to be accusing her of fraud. And now he doesn't have prosecutorial, he can't bring a criminal case in this instance, but he seems to be implying that she engaged in a fraud. She is the wife of a city council member. Ellison has endorsed Osman for re-election next month. So he would seem to have a fairly obvious conflict of interest. Yeah. He's one of the endorsers, along with Ilhan Omar, of this Jamal Osman, who's on the ballot next month. And yet he's bringing a lawsuit on her nonprofit and a second nonprofit that both of them were the original founders of.
Well, the other thing is he makes obviously makes a salary as a city councilman in Minneapolis, which I assume is around $100,000 a year. So he is dishing out contributions. He's like a major donor, in the around the country. I mean, donations to Seattle candidates running for office in Seattle, Washington, in Ohio. We start tracking all this campaign money. That where does the money come from? Maybe the government, maybe Feeding Our Future scandals, and then it's spread around to political candidates he likes, not just in Minnesota but around the country. So the guy's a politician, elected, on the ballot. His wife's running this nonprofit. He's making contributions all over. Should be a big story in a city like Minneapolis. We'll have to report it on our little podcast and on our website because no one else is going to cover it.
One more thing on that. You'll recall Osman was involved in some, again, just allegations. Nothing was ever proven. No charges were ever been brought. But his original election for city council, there was some talk of voting irregularities were supposed to have been investigated, but nothing ever came of that. Again, never been any charges filed, but this guy's got a long history of questionable activity.
Right. And wasn't the guy with the van and all the ballots on the dashboard of the van, wasn't that his cousin or something?
Again, nothing ever came of it, but every time something comes into the press, something bubbles up, somebody asks him and he has no comment and he gets away with it.
Yeah, we'll see. It'll catch up to him, I predict. A couple more topics before we go. Felon voting. As you know, the legislature in 2023 went off the cliff in many ways, including allowing felons the right to vote when their prison sentence was done, when they were no longer incarcerated, walk out of prison, you are now eligible to vote. Of course,
and Bill, keep in mind that in Minnesota, most convicted felons don't go to prison at all.
Ever. And the ones that do serve part of their time in prison and part of their sentence outside of prison on probation or parole. That's always been the way it's been in Minnesota. We've made that a policy decision. And you could vote. Your rights were restored to vote when your sentence was done. on paper, both incarcerated and on probation and parole. Legislature said, no, as soon as you're done with prison, or if you never go to prison, you can vote. But hold your cards, as we say in bingo. Hold your cards, hold your voter registration cards.
Yes.
Bingo and curling, you're kind of a two-sport star.
Hey, bingo's not a sport. We'll do another podcast on curling at another time. Now you've thrown me off my game. So there's a couple of attacks on the right to felon, on the felon voting issue in Minnesota. One, Minnesota Voters Alliance, using the Upper Midwest Law Center as their lawyers, have filed a suit challenging the law, and that is in its early stages. It was just filed in July. And then secondly, this week, a judge in Mille Lacs County convicted a couple of people to felony crimes, and then in separate orders, along with their convictions, said, by the way, don't vote. Don't register to vote. Don't go near the voting booth. You're a convicted felon. You can't vote. And he wrote two separate orders to go with his convictions. And, of course, Keith Ellison, Steve Simon, Secretary of State, all up in arms. How dare you do this? We passed this law. And the judge said it's an unconstitutional law. I don't have to follow it. And the key here is language, obviously, when it gets down to the constitutional law. The Constitution, despite what the legislature did, says you can vote. You're prohibited from voting as a felon until your civil rights, plural, have been restored. And I think the key is the plurality of that term. Voting is just one of your civil rights. That's the basis for the Upper Midwest Law Center's complaint, and I think the basis of this judge's complaint is that there's a lot of ambiguity here, or maybe not a lot of ambiguity. The Constitution's clear, John, but the legislature did something completely different.
Yeah, so this is an issue that is obviously destined for Minnesota's appellate courts. It's kind of nice to see a judge actually saying, "Well, I have to follow the Constitution," and in my view, this statute is clearly unconstitutional. So we'll see how it plays out.
It's
keeping in mind, by the way, that the Minnesota Supreme Court is a heavily DFL-dominated court.
I think it's interesting to look at, though, in the scheme of everything they did in the legislature, because this isn't the only thing they did when it comes to expanding voting. Would you say that's right, Bill? I mean, looking at how they're trying to get people under 18 pre-registered. There's other things about...
with the absentee ballots.
Yeah, the absentee ballots. So all of these things, I think, the felon aspect is one part, which is obviously unconstitutional, I think. But there's other things. I mean, this is a whole scheme by the left, really, to try and get more of their people voting.
Yeah, and Steve Simon's been running around the state all summer, with these, felons with felonies on your records, you can vote now. He's in this whole PR campaign, signing people up, helping them register to vote. So a judge in Mille Lacs County saying, you better not vote, he's very concerned about this because it's counter message, it's
by
counter
the way,
narrative.
didn't they criminalize telling felons they can't vote? Isn't that something else that they passed?
Criminal? Well, I guess, yeah. If you can't say things about an election within 60 days of the election that is untrue.
Well, the example
who
of
gets
that,
to
and
judge
again,
that?
I don't remember the exact wording of that statute, but the example that I've heard several people use of how that law would be applied is if somebody's going around saying, if you're a felon, you can't vote. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good example of what they had in mind that they are trying to criminalize. Which
Steve Simon should take this judge up on those charges. Come on,
exactly.
Put your money where your mouth is. That'd be phenomenal. Let's see him try to sue, or Ellison will go after the sitting judge. Woo.
Well, and this wasn't in Minnesota, but there was a guy that just got 7 months in prison for his meme about texting to vote.
Yeah.
So I think that wouldn't be surprised if that kind of
that's
comes
their
to
goal.
Minnesota.
All right, last topic, fun topic, even though the times are not that fun. We're coming up on Thanksgiving soon. It's late October or mid-October. And we have a tradition here in Center of the American Experiment with Thanksgiving and turkeys. And, of course, that's the Golden Turkey Award, the award for the silliest, wasteful spending of the year. Could be a state government project, a local government project, county, anything kind of related to government spending. The first winner was the Walsh morgue, which everybody thought was a complete waste of money. Thankfully, didn't need it and sold it at a loss. Other winners include a $7 million rest stop, a bus stop where no buses ever came. A lot of transit ideas in this, as you'll see. We give a Lifetime Achievement Award to the Southwest Light Rail Transit Project because if we didn't give it a Lifetime Achievement Award, it would just win every year because it just continues to be a golden turkey a mess. And then one other. Oh, Feeding Our Future. That won last year. The Feeding Our Future's fraud scandal won last year. So that nominations are open. You can go to goldenturkeymn.com and tell us what you think should be nominated. And John, it doesn't have to be a huge project like Feeding Our Future, which was $300 or $400 million in fraud. It can be anything, right?
Yeah, we're not looking necessarily for the biggest items of wasteful spending, although they're not disqualified like Feeding Our Future. But what we're really looking for are items of spending that illustrate that are stupid, that are kind of maybe amusingly foolish. And that illustrate the contempt that people in government have for your money.
Yeah, so give us your best ideas. You are out there in the communities you live in. If you see something stupid, nominate it. The nominations are open. We're getting a lot of them. We're getting nominations for the bus to Duluth, or the train to Duluth that the legislature funded. Again, another transit one. The governor's mansion rebuild is getting quite a few nominations early on. So we'll see what gets nominated, and we'll put together 4 finalists. And then the vote will open in a week or so, and get your votes in. And in the spirit of podcast, we're going to let another podcast announce the winner. Joe Souchere, his podcast, the Garage Logic podcast, is going to announce the winner on Wednesday of Thanksgiving week. So watch for that in the future. So we can plug other podcasts.
Might I raise a related turkey question?
Sure.
You can't go anywhere around here, at least in Golden Valley, without seeing a pack of like 6 to 12 turkeys. Where the heck? Flocks, excuse me.
Turkeys are flocks. Okay.
Where did they come from? This did not used to happen. No, isn't this kind of new? Do you know the story of where all of the suburban wild turkeys came from?
I don't know. I mean, the wild turkey was like almost extinct like 30 years ago. And now you're right. You have to shoo them away from the door of our building to walk in.
They sit in the tree out there. I didn't even know that was a quality that turkeys
Are you looking for a conspiracy theory here? Do you have one in mind?
It's a scientific question.
Yeah.
Is it government's fault? Bill, you're our
Maybe. It's a
investigative
bird.
journalist. Bill, maybe you need to get to the bottom of this turkey thing in Minnesota. Why are we having so many turkeys around?
I think they came from up south. They used to be ubiquitous where I grew up in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and now you find them all over the place.
All right,
it's just like John said.
So according to Bill, it's global warming. Global warming has caused turkeys because it's so much warmer here. We're like 10 degrees warmer now every winter, so the turkeys have followed us. That's the issue. Okay. Global warming,
solved.
more turkeys, but don't let it distract you from nominating a very good Golden Turkey Award, goldenturkeymn.com. And that's all the time we have. No more extraneous topics about turkeys to bring up. We'll see you next time on the American Experiment Podcast.